Hey, everybody. Welcome to the third video in our series on conversation. So if you haven't checked out the other two, appreciate you go back and the last week we talked about listening. We're really just trying to reclaim conversation in our society. And so one of the things we wanted to talk about today is the way we think. And we're going to start out talking about our brains, because our brains, Trevor, are constantly working against us sometimes. Our brains do something all day long. Our brains see things or hear things, and we're constantly categorizing. So we often talk about labels, and that's just the way our brains work. In order to understand the world we live in, we categorize, and then our brains also come back on after that and like to simplify. So once we've categorized things, our brains start to say, this isn't important, this is, and start to rank and file those things away. And one of the things that it does is that we've talked about how our brains work better with the simpler choices that we have. So if you notice, whether it be the cola wars of the 90s, or any brand war that you see, most things always come down to a series of choices. So in politics, we have Democrat, Republican, left and right. We have Coke or Pepsi. We have ways that our brains just naturally like to come down. We work better with the fewer choices that we have. So if you've ever been stuck, or if you've been trying to get your child to make a choice between 15 things, you always know it works better when you say, well, how about this one or this one? That is simply the way our brains work. But when we talk about conversation, that really kind of goes against us, because what we end up doing often is working on the assumption that every issue, every conversation point has to be about one side or the other. And so what we would call dualistic thinking is the way that we often find ourselves defaulting to, and it doesn't really lend to very good conversations. Simplicity is the way our brain works and searches for, and it's not a bad thing, but it doesn't always work for us. Right, Trevor?
Yeah. And so I use the example of Twitter. Twitter is kind of interesting because it is all about simplicity. You have 140 characters. And so you will see things of, just some dude watching the football game and he spouts off 140 characters of why he hates the other team, right? It's simple, but there's not a lot of depth to it. There's not a lot of complexity. There's not a lot of reflection and thought to it, but it's simple. And so we shoot that out there. Right. Then you take someone who's, like one of these people I like that are, these huge thinkers, have written books and everything. And then they sum up like something in one of their books into 140 characters. And you're like, whoa, I could never do that on Twitter. So that's simple, but it's simplicity on the other side of complexity. And I think that's what we miss a lot of times in our conversation is simplicity is good, and simplicity is what we're hoping to get to, but you can't have good simplicity until you have a lot of complexity. So you have to have those conversations. You have to have the nuance, and you have to have, the discussion and the time and the space that we talked about last time to be able to say, hey, I want to get to a simple understanding of this, but man, it's going to take a lot of work to get there, because simplicity is a good thing when it comes on the other side of complexity.
Yeah. Well, we both really love Rob Bell. Rob Bell's a fantastic communicator. And I recently heard him say that, in talking to communicators, that, you may give a 30-minute talk, but if you can't sit down and tell me what it is in about 10 seconds, then you don't understand. So yeah. I think that's what you're talking about there. The idea of simplicity is a wonderful thing. Our brains work that way for a reason. We search for the bottom line. But if I can't explain what I'm saying in that short time period, maybe I don't quite understand what I'm trying to say at all. And really what that does is trying to say that nuance and specifics are always important to us. I mean, while our brains search for simplicity, at the same time, I don't want to be put into a box. I don't want to have just the label on me. So although our brains are categorizing all day long, I don't want to only be known by that. So we fight simplicity in that way. And that's why in conversations, a lot of times, if we're just being so simplistic, the simplicity before complexity that you were talking about, then really all we're doing is relying on the labels or the stereotype or whatever it is, that very simple understanding of who that person or that issue is. And while our brains search for that, everybody hates that. None of us like to be put in that very simplistic box. And so we have to go through that idea of giving somebody the respect, once again, to say, you are more complicated than the simplistic way that I often want to understand you or your side or your issue or your viewpoint.
And you think about like how it happens in conversation. You're talking to someone and someone kind of shares an opinion with you. And to you, maybe that's the first time you've heard this person say that. For them, that's something that they may have been thinking on for years and years and years and reflecting in conversation. And unless you kind of take the time to pause and say, okay, tell me what's behind that. I need to understand where you're coming from on that. Then you just say, oh, okay, here's the bottom line. Your bottom line doesn't agree with mine. So clearly we're in conflict. And usually what we assume is, so clearly you're wrong. But when you have a more non-dualistic approach, you can come in and say, okay, well, let's see why these appear to be competing, and let's have a different conversation. And what you'll often find is that in those conversations, while you may disagree with the bottom line, you probably agree with a lot more of the other things that led to that bottom line.
Yeah.
And so you have to have that nuance.
I love that. It was an Apple commercial during the Super Bowl, last year, I think, the Maya Angelou poem, "We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike." And that's really what it's talking about. And we keep using that phrase, given space for the other, but we giving one another space. That's often what the art of conversation is about, is trying to find that nuance, that specificity, that we may end up in simplicity again, once we try to make a decision or categorize, but it's really the art of going in and finding the specificity, the nuance of that other person or their viewpoint that really isn't always natural for us, but that's where the great conversations come from.
And when you get to that point in simplicity, I mean, think about you and I, we've known each other for years. There's certain things that you and I can just say, hey, what about this? And
Right.
we know because we've had those conversations for years and years and years. But without that, some of those things get really convoluted. And like you said, our brains are working against us. We're trying to simplify, we're trying to separate and make things dualistic. And so it takes intentionality. And like you kept saying, we're trying to create respect. We're trying to create space for another person. And sometimes that space is allowing us to just hold intention. And sometimes it means, okay, I see your point and it seems right. And I see my point and it seems right. But they're competing. So we don't know what to do with that because we're so dualistic. Which one is right? Which one wins? We have that competition thing we talked about. But non-dual thinking and kind of the art of conversation is saying, I'm going to sit in this tension. And I'm going to sit in tension and not assume you're wrong and not assume I'm wrong, and just kind of say, well, let's let these be and let's see where it goes and let's have the conversation. And part of that is disagreeing well. And so next week, we're going to tackle that, and we're going to kind of conclude our series on the art of conversation and end with how to disagree well. So thanks for tuning in. Again, as always, subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, and let us know what you would like to hear from us. Grace and peace, everybody.
Bye, everybody.